My name is Carol McCoy. Today is May 27th, 2025. We're at the offices of the Nashville Bar Association in downtown Nashville. This interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association, and it's my privilege to be able to interview Barbara Mayden. Barbara, we're going to talk a little bit about your background, and as we start, I'd like you to tell me your full name and your date and place of birth, and then we'll talk a little bit about your family.
Okay, I can do that. My name is Barbara Mendel Mayden, and my date of birth,
Date of birth and where you were.
September 18th, 1951. And I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Tell me a little bit about your grandparents, both your father's side and your mother's side. And I think you told me your father's parents were Dora or Dorothy and Simon Mendel.
My father's parents were Dorothy and Simon Mendel. They were immigrants. And they immigrated through, I know my grandmother, Dora, immigrated through Galveston, which was a port of entry at the time for a lot of Jewish immigrants. And they settled in Georgia. And my mother's parents were also immigrants from Russia. That was Benjamin Krugman, and his wife was Mary Krugman. And they ended up settling in Atlanta, Georgia. My grandfather immigrated. He joined the Army in World War I so he could learn English. He joined at age 14. He learned English and settled then into Atlanta, Georgia.
And then your parents were?
My parents were Blanche and Eugene. They met at University of Georgia right before the war. They when my dad got back from the war, before I was born, my sister was born, they moved down out to Colorado, and they started setting up a life in Colorado. They were buying a store, they were doing something, and then, oops, my dad got called back into the Army. Well, they couldn't, my mother had this new baby, they couldn't do that, so they sold the business, what they had, and they made it back to Atlanta and found out it was a big mistake. And so they,
The Army didn't want him?
No, he had not been called back.
Oh.
It was just a
Fluke.
Right.
So your father grew up in Dalton, Georgia?
My father grew up actually in Monroe, Georgia.
Monroe.
Right.
Okay.
And then ended up in Dalton. And that's where their family store was, in Dalton.
And your mother grew up in Atlanta?
In Atlanta.
And your father was born January 29, 1924?
That's correct.
And if you told me correctly before, your mother was born in December 6th of 1928.
Correct.
So there was a little age difference there. Tell me a little bit about your mother and your father.
Well, they were extraordinary. My mother graduated high school early at 14. She went to Georgia. She was a double major in biology and music, piano. She was a piano prodigy. I have a great picture of my mother with a big bow in her hair, with a little 6-year-old playing with the Atlanta Symphony, little Miss Krugman, to play with the symphony. So she was a piano player her whole life, but she was also a medical technologist. This was back before women really went to law school. To medical school. But she was a hard worker and a smart woman and wonderful. And my dad was had a children's clothing store in Dalton, Georgia.
And I think you told me you were born in Chattanooga.
I was,
but they had also been to Colorado.
That before, right? But they ended up back in Dalton, but Dalton was a little small, so they moved to Chattanooga, which was a short commute to Dalton.
And the reason is because he thought he was called up, but your mother had a baby.
Yes,
and that's
my big sister. Right.
And what is her name?
That's my sister Mary, and she lives in Macon, Georgia.
And do you see her very often?
I see her as often as I can. You know, it's miracles do occur because we were like this during childhood and now we're like this. So we're best friends.
And what did she do as she got older?
She is a lawyer. She's now a retired lawyer and she's now a tennis player.
Wonderful.
But she is a lawyer
Um,
and married to a lawyer, retired lawyer. So we started with no lawyers in our family. And now both my sister and I ended up being lawyers, and we both married people who had law degrees. I say that because my husband has a law degree but didn't practice.
well, we'll get to that a little bit
Okay,
later
that's
on,
good.
but right now
We're
let's start
family
off about
lawyers.
being a little girl with your sister in your
Mhm,
childhood.
mhm.
You're born in Chattanooga,
Yes,
and part of what we wanted to know is about home life
Mhm.
and then where you started school.
sure. But home life was in Chattanooga, and when it was time to leave for college, my father took out a map of the United States, and he took out a compass. And he put the point of the compass where Chattanooga is and drew a circle that he figured out was 400 miles on a map, and he put it on the map 400 miles and said, you can go to any state university you can get into within the circle, because he figured 400 miles was a one-day drive.
But before you did that, you had to go to,
Brainerd High School.
well, I think you told me that at first you were in a small elementary school for kindergarten.
Mhm.
Anna B. Lacey,
I started at Anna B. Lacey,
and then
went to the, then we
Woodmere.
moved, then went to Missionary Ridge for a
Okay.
couple of years, and
Mhm.
then we moved and went to Woodmore Elementary.
And when you say move, you're moving within Chattanooga?
Within Chattanooga,
Okay,
right.
so you went to
Woodmore Elementary.
Did you follow your sister through all of that?
Mary just went to Missionary Ridge.
Okay.
And then
Where was junior high?
Dalewood Junior High School and Brainerd High School.
And if I'm right, you graduated in 1969 from high school.
Correct.
And what were some of the hobbies or activities that you had while you were in high school, middle
Well,
school?
the highlight of my life was being the marching band at Brainerd High School. Now, I didn't play an instrument, but I was a majorette and could twirl the baton. But then it became very clear before my senior year that there were two of us that made majorette when we first got to high school, me and Diane. And Diane was the one who was good. She, she listened, she did what she was told. That wasn't my strong suit. So it became clear to me that when we became seniors, that she was going to be the head majorette. And the thought of taking orders from Diane Maxwell was just more than I could handle. So secretly, I went off and learned how to be a drum major. And I tried out for drum major and became the drum major. So I was the boss of everybody, including Diane, which was great. Now, the big secret was that we had to go into band, and the band director would have to, the new whatever we were going to play for Friday night. And he would go through it once, and he called me Charlie. He said, okay, Charlie, now you do it. So I got up. He never knew that I couldn't read music. I had a good ear, and I could hear it, and I could direct it. But he never knew that I couldn't read music, but I wasn't the drum major.
It must have been a gift you got from your mother.
I think so. I think so.
Did you learn piano?
I tried to learn piano. It just wasn't my thing, right? Because I would be playing the piano and my mother would be in the kitchen in the other room, and I would get a wrong note and she would yell from the other room, D, it's D. And I thought, I can't do this. So I really did not take piano for very long.
You told me that your family didn't travel all that much while you were in grade school.
Right.
And that you did apparently in high school, you could drive over and fill up the trunk with some alcohol.
Well, I was doing some really responsible things. So our idea of a Good Friday night would be to go down to 9th Avenue, which was, or 9th Street in Chattanooga, which wasn't very safe. Find somebody on the corner, give them some money to go in and buy some alcohol, which you would do. Then we would take it down to the drive-in movie. and two of us would get in the trunk, so we didn't have to pay to get in. We'd get in the trunk, go into the drive-in movie, and enjoy the drive-in movie with our ill-gotten goods. It was. I never got caught.
And had a good time.
And had a good time. Don't tell my children.
They will not be listening. What were some of your hobbies while you were in grade school and high school? What did you,
Twirling the baton, and I
and
was a reader.
that's what I have, is
Yeah,
that
I was
reading,
a reader.
that you rode the
Mhm.
bus to the library. for
Yeah,
the
those
time.
were back in the days when, as a little girl, I could go down the hill behind my house and get the public, the bus, go downtown to the library and go check out books and go home.
During high school, what kind of work experiences did you have?
Well, I worked my first job was at Service Merchandise, checking people out, and then I made a mistake, and so I got fired. But then I'd also work as a waitress, which was personality forming. You learn a lot about people as a waitress when you're 16 or 17.
Did you help your dad at all?
Yeah, I would go down and help my dad, at the store. Mhm.
And how about your mother? I think you said that.
But my mother was a med tech,
Right.
and I remember she was, worked at some Tri-County Hospital, in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. And I remember I had a summer job, in the lab, and I was doing a heck of a job. And I remember the pathologist coming out one day, Dr. Elrod, and saying, Barbara, you're doing a heck of a job. You can make somebody a great secretary one day. And I'm thinking, hell, I will,
Wasn't
So-
the voice that you wanted to hear encouraging you?
Right.
How about camp counseling?
I was a camp counselor, absolutely. Big camp family.
Did you do that just one summer or?
Oh, no, many summers. I went to camp every summer, and then when I was too old to be a camper, I became a counselor.
And I believe that you said you were a member of the National not historical, Honor Society?
Oh, I think I sort of snuck in my senior year of the National Honor Society, right?
19. Okay, then you were starting to tell me about your father and the compass, about
Right,
college.
college.
So
we didn't
how
go to
did you
college.
choose a college?
Well, I took the compass, and I was looking at all the state universities within that circle. And, I was born and raised in Chattanooga, never went many places. Our family was in Atlanta, so I would travel down to Atlanta, but I didn't know nothing. And so I wanted to go away. And so in 1967, I think it was, Indiana had played in the Rose Bowl. And so I watched the Rose Bowl and thought, that's awfully pretty. That was my campus visit. So I got accepted at Indiana. That was along in the circle. So I went to Indiana, which I thought was up north. I didn't know the difference between up north and Midwest. But so that's how I got to Indiana University.
And how did you decide on a major?
I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, which was sort of bizarre back then. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I took the major that I thought was most likely to get me there. So that was political science. And then I also did a lot in literature, because that was for fun.
And were there courses that you favored when you were taking these studies? I think you mentioned something about Russian history.
I was taking a course in Russian history. I don't remember how I got to do this, but I got to create my course with a Russian history teacher, where I would read fiction, Russian fiction, and get the history from that. It was maybe the best course I ever had.
How would you describe your study habits when you were in college?
I would say they were haphazard in the last minute, and but got me through and did just fine. I had to fit that studying in with some pretty great socializing and working. So.
And I wanted to ask you about the working.
Mhm.
How did you handle working and finding jobs?
Well, there was always a job everybody always needs a waitress. And I was there to oblige, and, and I just, that age, you just don't need much sleep. I can remember working at a pizza joint, on Third Avenue in Bloomington. And I would, go and serve pizzas, and then afterwards you're required to stay after closing to wash the pizza pans. And then get home, and God only knows AM in the morning. And I remember having an early class across the street. It was like a biology class across the street. And I would get up, put a coat over my pajamas, sit through the class and go back and go to sleep. And it was like a dream. But somehow I passed.
Did you also have a drugstore job?
I worked at Brummett's drugstore, and I was a cashier. That was a good job. I like working at Brummett's.
Did you do both of those jobs at the same time?
No,
while
it's
college?
seriatim. Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
What kind of activities did you have? I think socially, you pledged a sorority?
I was in a sorority, and still some of my best friends are those girls that I was in the sorority with back in the day.
And what sorority was that?
Pi Beta Phi, 928 East 3rd Street. I can sing the songs, but I won't.
I don't know that. Would be wonderful if you would, but I'm
No,
not sure
no,
that's what this is
no,
about
right,
today.
Right. It was a great experience, and as someone later said, that's where I learned to realize how much I loved women, other women.
I think that is true there. And then there is a reunion that you have with them every now and then?
Yep.
What's it called?
It's called the Mean Girls. We call ourselves the Mean Girls because it's this group of girls that pledged a sorority at the same time. And we got together and said, wouldn't it be fun, to get together? This was like 25 years ago. We thought we would. We thought, well, should we invite everybody in our class? We thought, no, well, you know what? We didn't like them much then. We're not going to like them much now. So we dubbed ourselves Mean Girls. And the Mean Girls still gets together every year. And it's wonderful. You go and you shed all those years afterwards. And it's like you're 19 years old,
That's
without husbands, without children, without debts, without
responsibility.
Exactly.
So you're working during college,
Mhm.
but during the summer, what did you do?
Worked.
And were you still being a waitress,
I was waitressing. I was sort of any job I could get. So
camp counselor?
camp counselor. I was waitressing. I waitressed at a place called Lorette Villa in Chattanooga. I remember that. Whatever job I could get.
One of the questions that they like to focus on is the impact of major social, economic, and political events that were happening during the time that you were in college.
Mhm.
And you mentioned a few.
Oh yeah, it was a interesting time to be in college. It was
This is
late
19.
60s, early 70s.
That's right.
There was a lot going on. And so juxtaposing my sorority life and my marching against the war life was sort of an interesting juxtaposition. I was able to do both of those things, and did. I always laugh because my sister was at the University of Georgia at the time. Somehow she wasn't able to make her graduation because she was in jail.
Oh.
Those were the days.
And I think part of what you said is that you were active politically.
Yes.
Did you work in any campaigns during that time?
Oh, absolutely. I always was active politically from high school on. And
how do you think you became active politically? Because your mother's a medical technician,
Mhm.
and your father is running a store.
It was just the era, it was just the era. When, the war was going on, things were just.
The Vietnam War.
Right.
Right.
Things seemed important. Civil rights movement was going on. And there was a lot of legislation. It was Martin Luther King. It was just something that was, you did.
Which candidate do you recall working for first?
There was Hebert Humphrey. I worked for I worked locally for Bass for Senate. I worked for And I remember, I guess it's Randy, I guess, and Bill Brock, B-R-O-C-K. He was the opponent.
Oh.
Right. But I was always active politically.
And did there happen to be any repercussions for your family? Anybody,
Oh, yeah.
what happened?
Oh, yeah. You know, being known liberals, me, not just my parents, you know, had repercussions. There was a cross burned in my yard.
How did your parents react to that?
That's equanimity, you know, just that's Barbara. You know, it just was what it was.
They were very supportive.
Well, they were somewhat supportive. They were trying to rein me in, but there was only so much reining in they could do.
So as you're getting ready to graduate
Mhm.
and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do next, what did you decide? You said you always wanted to be a lawyer. What did you decide to do?
About what?
Going to law school.
Well, I
What
decided
made,
I
what
was
made
going
you?
to law school. That was something I always knew I would do, and it's funny, I always said I was gonna do it. And, I remember going home vividly, and my dad, who had spent every cent he had getting me and my sister through college, and, he was saying, well, so what's next? You know, I said, well, law school. And I remember saying, it just looked stricken. He said, law school, I can't afford to send you to law school.
Did you decide to go before your sister?
Yes, because she married a guy in the Navy. And he was traveling, so she was doing that. So she didn't go to law school until after they settled down. So I said I was going to law school.
So
Said I can't send you to law school. I said, well, I'll send myself to law school. And as I say, went to the highest bidder and started law school at Indiana, the highest bidder. And then after a year, I said, it's not what I want to be now. So I ended up transferring to somebody who matched the bid. That was the University of Georgia. And that's where I went to law school.
I think earlier when we were chatting about this interview, you told me that you had thought about being a lawyer and that there was one thing that you wanted to do that was rare for your family to have steak for dinner.
Well, yes, I wanted to find a job. You know, we grew up without much money, and it was a big deal in our family. If we ever went out to eat, we went out to eat. But one thing you were not allowed to do is order steak unless it was a birthday or something really special. And I decided I was going to get a job, some kind of job where I could order whatever I wanted to when I went out to dinner. So I was thinking about different careers. I could go and be like a banker. But well, if I go to be a banker as a girl, they just stick me behind the teller's cage. The progression didn't seem as smooth. I thought, well, I could be a lawyer and they can't put me behind the teller's cage because I'll be a lawyer. I have a title. Now, who knew? You know, who knew that it wasn't quite so easy? But I needed to graduate with some initials after my name that would make it very hard to stick me in a low-paying corner.
Tell me about this first year in law school. You selected the university?
I selected Indiana University, highest bidder, and just felt out of sorts. I mean, I had nobody in my family. I didn't know about law and whatever. And being a girl in the class was tough.
How many were there in your class?
Very few. I can't give you a number, but there were very few. And it was back in the early day. And I remember we had this fabulous contracts professor, Professor Stanger, that was back when the movie had come out, whatever that movie was about law school, about the curmudgeonly professor. Well, they took that straight from this guy. This was this guy. And apparently one day he was told that he had to start calling on women because he would just not call on women. And there were maybe 2 women in my classroom. And so he started calling women. It would be first person on Monday morning. He would call on a woman. So you always knew when you would get called on and you didn't have to be prepared for the rest of the week until the next Monday because there are only 2 women, so you would get called on. It was an interesting time. So I spent most of my time playing pinball across the street. And then one day, one of my classmates came up to me and said toward the end of the year, he said, you know, you're such a waste. So what do you mean I'm such a waste? What does that say? He said, you know, you just you just gave it up early. You know, you could have been this, you could have been that, and you just didn't. And I'll never forget it. And I said, oh yeah, well, maybe he's right. So I decided I need to start over. And I picked up and I transferred and started over and did a little better. Tried a little harder.
When you picked up and tried a little harder, what did you do?
I transferred to the University of Georgia and actually studied.
And who were some of the professors that made an impact on you?
Okay.
You said
Yes.
Stranger. He was your contracts professor,
Stanger.
Stanger.
Stanger. He was at Indiana.
right? He made an impact on
He
you.
made an impact, but they were a lot. One of my professors was Dean Rusk, right, the former Secretary of State, and he was a good advisor for me.
Was he your advisor?
Well, just more of a mentor-mentee. It wasn't a formal
Okay.
advisor.
Were there the same number of women in your class in law school?
Very few. There were but a few. There
Yeah.
were a few.
But it was the same kind
Yeah.
of ratio,
Yeah.
regardless of whether it's
Yeah.
Indiana or Georgia.
Yeah.
And I think you said there was a Perry Centel.
Perry Centel, who was he was the renowned torts professor, but torts was first year class, and I transferred second year, so I didn't have him for torts. But he was very well known because there was a great tradition at Georgia. It was called Paul's Graph Day. And on Paul's Graph Day, at Centel's class, somebody would come, everybody would come. I would come and watch Paul's Graph afterwards, and where they had this whole thing going on Paul's Graph Day, which was great. But I had him for a class on local government law, and he was absolutely inspiring. He was a wonderful professor.
And I think you told me that you never took property law.
I never took property. It was always I always would have nightmares, literally, that somebody would figure that out, because at Indiana, property was a first year class. At Indiana, property is second year class. At Georgia, it was first year.
And nobody ever.
And nobody ever caught the fact that I never took property.
So you are now in law school, and you told your father that you were going to pay for it. What did you do to?
Well, took out a lot of loans. It's so funny now. I took out a lot of loans. I worked all through law school. But it's so interesting. You compare what it costs now and what it cost then. And I'm not talking inflation. I'm talking, when you hear now law students and the barriers to law school, you can't write it off to inflation. I don't know exactly what the ratio is or what the number is. It is stunning. And so, yeah, I paid for it, but and I paid off the loans.
And how did you spend your summers?
Working.
And do you recall?
Oh yeah,
where you
working. One of my greatest jobs, I was in Atlanta. So this time my parents had divorced. My mother was in Atlanta. I spent summers in Atlanta with family. And I worked at a fancy store at Lenox called Britches of Georgetown. It was a very fancy men's store. And it was a great job working at Britches. You met all the fancy men.
Did you have any law-related
I
experience?
did. I worked at, I guess back there was HEW, and I was in the Black Lung group. My job was to write briefs denying people Black lung benefits. It was very fulfilling. Just why I wanted to be in law school is to do that with my life.
I think we mentioned some of your friends that you made in law school, some of the fellows. Do you recall, like Bobby Glenn?
Bobby Glenn was a good friend, and Mike Schroeder. We ended up traveling Europe together.
And Bill Cherry.
Bill Cherry was a boyfriend, and he was, he was in my class. He was a Vanderbilt grad, and at Georgia.
And Stan
Queller, Stan Queller wasn't in law school with me. That's from Chattanooga.
Okay.
I don't remember who Stan was.
Okay.
In law school.
Oh
yeah, no, I do remember Stan Shapiro.
Okay.
He showed up in my office in New York one day. Richard Siegel, he was the Paul's Graph guy, who is now a great pianist. You can go on Facebook and look up Richard Siegel, because he will be playing the piano on Facebook.
Uh, How would you assess the value of your law school curriculum? Not necessarily at Indiana, but
And the value in teaching me how to practice law or teacher.
they're asking you, I think, for your perspective on how it benefited you career-wise, the value of the law school curriculum. And that means the classes that you took either in local government or municipal corporations.
Those were good. What law school did was change the way you think. And I remember when I first got out of law school and I realized that I was thinking very differently. I was resentful because it took your mind, which was really very broad and thinking whatever, and it started making you get to the point. What's the issue? What's the issue? Get to the point. And it changed the way you addressed life. And it changed the way you thought. I remember much about the rule against perpetuities? No, but it taught me how to address issues.
One of the things that you realize when you moved to law schools is you were going to look for a job.
Yes.
And it was important that you get it with a good law firm. So what
Yes.
did you decide?
Well, I wanted to go with a good law firm. I wanted to be able to, I wanted that steak dinner. I wanted the, I didn't have, I needed that training. And so, I knew I had to be in the upper 10% of my class. And, cause that's what they were doing. And I ended up in the upper 10% of my class. Exactly. There were 200 people in my class. I was number 20. No, they didn't want to know what number they wanted. You could just say upper 10%. And so that was the goal. And yeah, that went over the goal line.
Now, your life is full of secrets. For
Mhm.
instance, you didn't take property law.
Right. Did not take property law. Don't tell anybody. Right.
And another secret was that when you transferred,
Oh yeah, that was great. That's a great trick. When I told you I was spending most of my time playing pinball. And this guy said, you're just not paying attention, whatever. But I learned, yeah, this is good, is that if you transfer, you start over. They don't transfer grades, that you just start with a clean slate. So I got to start over. So none of those pesky first year classes counted as my grade point. Shh.
all right. So we're now working our way through law school, and I want to just take a moment here to talk about your family.
Yes.
And at this point, you're in law school, but you're not married.
No.
At what point did you become married?
That was way later.
All right. And
But much to my family's horror.
we're still going to bring him forward. So who did you end up marrying?
I ended up marrying a guy in New York. I ended up in New York after I left law school. I was in Atlanta for a few years, and then I realized I started going to New York in business, and I realized there was something they hadn't told me about at University of Georgia, and that was New York. So I decided I really needed, I still had this Chattanooga narrowness about me. I needed to learn something about the world, and I would go to New York for a couple of years, and that turned into 20. And so I was working hard. I was with these big law firms working hard. And one day I worked on a deal and we're traveling around the country and closing deals and doing that. And my client calls me and said, Barbara, I've been worried about you. So why? He said, because you're just working so hard and you just, you need to, get out and do things. I said, okay, fine. You're not dating anybody. So fine, find me somebody to date. So I have. I said, okay, you find him with this great guy, whatever. I said, that sounds great. Where does he work? Here at Bankers Trust. I said, well, I can't date anybody at Bankers Trust. That's my client. And he said, and I remember he said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I disagree, but I respect your decision. I said, great. I hung up and I remember so well. I was so proud of myself. And 5 minutes later, the phone rings. And it's that guy. They just ignored what I said, and he invites me to lunch. Here's a guy who works for a client inviting you to lunch. How can you not go?
Yeah,
Right?
right.
So I went to lunch with him. It was at the World Trade Center. You remember the World Trade Center? I went down. I had a nice lunch, and I thought, you know what? Carol's another job. This guy's pretty cute. So that's who I married.
Okay. And then, when did you get married? What,
In 1986.
1986? Okay. And I think, you have 3 daughters?
I have 3 daughters. I figure I have plenty of time. I'm only, 38, 39. I have plenty of time, right? Well, not so much. So as I am fond of saying, I had babies every way you can have them. I had them by in vitro, by adoption, and by accident. And they came bang, bang, bang. And then I had 3 children.
So when you say by adoption, what do you mean that?
I meant, I had had several miscarriages, and so my dear friend Carol Lamb and her husband in Washington, they had gone through adoption with this agency and put us in touch with this agency in New Jersey. And I got a call. I was working at Skadden Arps. I'm sitting in my office one day, and I got a call that I was pregnant. That was great. So I called downtown. My husband's on the trading floor. I said, yeah, that's great. We're pregnant. That's great. And I hung up. About 10 minutes later, the phone rings again. It's the adoption agency. It's a baby available for adoption. Oh dear. Called him back and said, are you sitting down? Luckily, the baby was 6 months old. So I remember driving between New York and New Jersey to get this baby thinking, I can't be green, because I don't want to tell him I'm pregnant. Because, who knows what would happen. So those were the first 2. And then.
And what's your oldest daughter's name?
That's Samantha.
Okay. And how old is she now?
Samantha's 34.
And what does she do?
Samantha is in Denver, Colorado. She is doing God's work. She is a counselor. She's a MSW counselor for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. She counsels homeless children and families.
All right. And then your second daughter?
My second daughter is
The
Jenny.
In vitro daughter.
That is the in vitro daughter. No, yes, that's the in vitro daughter. That's Jenny. She's in New York, and she's designs and produces menswear for menswear firms.
And your third child was an
Talia, by
accident?
accident, and they were quick to point that out to her. When the occasion arises, which is often. And she's also in New York. She directs commercials, but she hates it when I call it this TikTok influencer.
Oh.
So she's doing designing and art, whatever, on TikTok.
And
Talia Mayden, Google her.
I will. How
She's
old is
30.
She's 30 right now, and Jenny is
32-ish.
okay. Now, I had to do that little excerpt. You had to cover a little bit of your career in order to explain how you met your husband, but we're going to go back and
Okay.
cover this the right way. And we now have you at the end of law school,
Yes.
and you have to take the bar exam.
Yes.
But unlike a lot of people, you took it early.
Well, no, that was what was done back then. In Georgia, you could take an early bar, and so they had a February bar. You took 3rd year law school. So took February bar, and it was just great because that meant when you got out of law school and you set your job, you were done with the bar. You could take the summer off, which I did, and just be carefree, and which was
What did
great.
you do that summer?
I went to Europe, backpacked around Europe.
With some of your
Couple
law school buddies?
Yeah. Yes.
And where did you go?
Well, actually, went, and the first stop was going to be a cruise. And so went to Greece and got on the ship. And I was by myself. I was meeting with some people later, just meeting with people. But I got on the ship and did the cruise. And one of the stops was in Mykonos. And stopped in Mykonos and got off the boat and looked around. Got back on the boat, got my stuff, got off the boat and stayed. Cruise, waved goodbye to the cruise and stayed in Mykonos for about a month. which is pretty great.
And did you travel anyplace else after that?
Yeah, just around. Yeah.
But you had your buddies with you?
Well, I met some friends from law school, and this Mike Schroeder and Bobby Glenn. We met up somewhere. I think we were in Wales.
Oh, did you know they were gonna be there, or it was
I don't
just
remember.
accidental?
I don't remember.
Okay. But now you're out of law school, you passed the bar, you're traveling through Europe,
Mhm.
and
But
What do
with
you-
a job lined up at the end.
what are you gonna do for a job?
Well, in Chattanooga, if you've been good and you die, you go to Atlanta. You know, so there was no question that I wanted to go to Atlanta. And got an offer from a great law firm in Atlanta and started there. It was huge. It was a huge law firm. They had 50 law. I was a 50th lawyer, I think. It's King and Spalding. For the 50th
Well
lawyer,
known.
right? And I was making just a ton of money. I think my at a law school they offered me $17,000 a year, and I knew I was making a lot of money because I just read the basketball coach Georgia was making. I guess maybe I was making 19,000 because he was making 17,000. I was making more than the basketball coach.
You were
George.
making
It
a
was
ton
a
of money.
ton of money. And that was my first job.
Were there any other women?
There were a couple. One of my dearest friends for life was Ruth West, and she was there. And then the famous Betsy Hishon was there. Betsy Hishon, who later sued the firm for sex discrimination. And so Betsy was there, Ruth was there, and there was another woman in my class who's still there named Chilton Varner, and that was it.
What were some of your first early cases and clients at King and Spalding?
Well, I went into the bond department.
How did you decide to do that?
It's, my the guy who became my mentor, this unbelievable guy named Bob Steed, was there. And, if I could be in Bob Steed's orbit, I wanted to be in Bob Steed's orbit. Loved my experience with Perry Centel and municipal corporations, municipal law, and that's how it started.
And what was the experience with Bob Steed?
Well, Bob Steed, that's a whole thing. Bob Steed was a partner. He was also had a column in the Atlanta paper, a humor column. Has humor books. He was hilarious. He was warm. He takes you under his arm and he flat teaches you what you need to do.
And I think you said that he had a different attitude about getting coffee.
Getting coffee.
Everyone would be asking for coffee when you get.
Oh, no, well, that's right. No, that's so anyway, so I was one of very few women, and back then it was sort of a novelty when you would go and there'd be a woman there. And he was, let's just say he wasn't Mr. Open-minded, Mr. Liberal or whatever, but he was wonderful to the women in his orbit, me and Ruth. And one day go into the conference room, all the investment bankers are there and whatever, and they go in and I walk in, this, kid, associate, and they started asking me to go out for coffee. They wanted coffee. And Bob stood up and said, "I'll get the coffee." He was just sensed that I needed to have a different persona in the room and not be the coffee getter.
You indicated that part of your learning experience was carrying the briefcase. And what did you mean by that?
That was back in the day where we had the luxury of learning by watching. And you weren't thrust into anything, you were just learned by watching. And you carry the briefcase. You go and watch a senior partner do what he does, and they were all he's back then, do what he does, and that's how you learned to do it.
And he was doing bond work.
He was doing bond work, but bond work was interesting. I always thought that bond work, it sounds like such a narrow specialty, but it is really a very broad specialty because it's finance. It is municipal finance, but it's finance, it's tax, You needed to know tax, you needed to know transactions, how to draft transactions. Much later, I taught a class at Vanderbilt on corporate documents, drafting corporate documents. And one of the things that I always teach in the class is you take a basic merger agreement, or trustnet or whatever, they're all the same. You have representations and warranties, you have covenants, you have, but your operational provisions are different, but that's a very small section. Your events of default, your covenants, your representations, it's all the same. So we had to learn all of that. And so I found it very broadening.
And how did that experience change you? What was happening while you're working at King and Spalding and you're carrying the briefcase and you're learning about bond work? What did you discover?
You learn how much of it is about affect. That I remember one day being in my office, and I was junior, I'd been carrying the briefcase, and apparently Bob Steeders, the senior partner, was out of town, and I get a call one day. And it was from investment bank, Morgan Stanley. And it was the guys on the phone saying, this is we're sort of the bond team at Morgan Stanley, and we have a question about this transaction. And I didn't know nothing. I was a second year associate. Panic, total panic. Then all of a sudden it hit me. I didn't know the answer, but they didn't know the answer either. You had to sound smart. You had to have that affect and say, what a great question. Let me get back to you on that. And let me get back to you on that is a perfectly acceptable answer. And how so much about being a leader is about carrying yourself as a leader and saying, I'll get back to you.
And then finding the answer.
And finding the answer.
And then getting back.
Right.
As you were carrying the briefcase, you said that you traveled around to a lot of closings.
Yes.
And what did you experience when you were traveling around?
Well, that was fun. And just, the more you did it, the more singing you got. And I was talking about when I was in New York, traveling around with this client, whatever. And sometimes you do closings all over the country. And one time we were carrying the briefcase. I remember we had a bunch of closings, and we were in Texas, and we had closings in Austin and then in Houston, and then we had to go to South Carolina. We had to go to Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm carrying the briefcase. I've carried the briefcase, but I'm carrying.
And you're talking
briefcase.
about a heavy briefcase.
It's a heavy briefcase. It's all your documents, and so carrying that briefcase and whatever, and I remember going to Charleston, not Charleston, we were in Columbia, and going into Nelson Mullins and doing the closing, and then I had to keep going. These guys were getting to go back to New York. I had to go to Minneapolis. So I'm carrying the briefcase. I'm still like, why is this thing still so heavy? And I'm carrying it, and I get to Minneapolis, and I get to the closing, and I'm going to Minneapolis, and I open the briefcase. They had taken the marble ashtray from Nelson Mullins and stuck it in the briefcase. And that's what I was lugging with me on that last leg of the thing. So yes, it was heavy, but not always with, trust indentures and merger agreements.
Well, in all these travels that you were doing, sometimes you went to New York City.
Right. I traveled in New York City, and I remember, oh gosh, there was another very senior partner in the bond department named Pope McIntyre, who was just wonderful. Now, he just hated all this stuff about women practicing law, and women had their place and everything. Well, that was until Mary Ellen, his daughter, went to law school. Then he was all over it. It was great. So he was quite the guy. He was, and I remember Pope's office, there was in his office, is southern to the, just all of southern on his office, the entire wall was a painting of Herschel Walker, football player from the University of Georgia. He was a Georgia guy. So his view of the world changed between Herschel and Mary Ellen. He was Mr. Equal Opportunity. But you would go to New York with Pope, and he taught you New York. He taught you where to eat. I learned about the Pong back before it was a franchise. I learned about the 21 Club. And you just learned. And I realized there was something about the world that nobody had told me about, and that was New York. So I thought, you know what, I need to do this New York thing. So I threw a dart and ended up going to a law firm in New York.
But before you did that, you were at King and Spalding, I think, when Carter was elected president.
Oh, yes, I was.
And you said,
I had the best view in the world because my office was here. On one side of my office was Jack Watson. And Jack Watson turned out to be special assistant to the president, whatever, so he knew a lot of people. But the better part of the view was down the hall to the corner office. And that was Charlie Curbo. And Charlie Curbo, I believe, was chief of the campaign. And he was chief of the transition. So anybody who wanted to come and see Charlie Curbo had to walk past my office. Well, I mean, the view was great. You saw everybody. And I'm this girl from Chattanooga, University of Georgia, and I was watching everything, and it was great. And then one day, I got a little jaded, I'm just used to it by that point. And then one day, my head turned, because who walked in but Gloria Steinem? Well, that got my attention. Gloria Steinem walks in. Well, I didn't know better. I had no filter. So she goes in and she's talking to Charlie Curbo and comes out, and I get up from my office and I go out and said, Gloria Steinem, I'm just so glad. I'm just so honored to meet you. I don't know when your flight is, but if you have a little time, do you mind talking to a few of the women here in the office? And she said, sure. Oh my gosh. So, we didn't have a computer those days. I called around and, there were only like 3 women lawyers, but the secretaries and the paralegals. I called and said,
all the women.
Gloria Steinem is here. Let's meet. So we went into the conference room on the 25th floor, and it was great. And so we talked about it, and she was wonderful. I remember this one secretary said, my boss sends me out to pick up his laundry and everything, and what do I do about that? And I remember her answer is, you need this job. Just do it. She was just so practical. It was great. So they all leave. It was like a Friday, and it was great. And I'm feeling just so great. And I go home that weekend. And so Sunday morning, I'm watching Meet the Press. And who's on Meet the Press? My buddy. It's Gloria Steinem. It's Gloria Steinem, And so they're asking her about the transition and, how the hell was the transition going? And she said, well, let me tell you this. She said, things are so bad in Charlie Curbo's law firm that they asked me for a special meeting. The women asked me for a special meeting to air their grievances. Oh my God, my whole life passed in front of me. That was not good. This was not good. No special meeting to air the grievances, just talk to us, whatever. Anyway, so I just thought that my whole life flashed in front of me. But interestingly, I go in, somehow, I guess all the partners were out playing golf. Nobody ever mentioned it. But can I flash forward?
Yes, please.
Flashing forward several years, many years, I was living in New York, and I was doing what stupid New York associates did, and going out to the Hamptons on weekend. And heaven forbid I should take the bus. I was flying out from this little airport in near I guess LaGuardia, I don't know, flying out to the Hamptons, and I'm sitting on this little plane, and who comes out to get on the plane but Gloria Steinem? It was Gloria Steinem and her boyfriend Mort Zuckerberg, and they get on the plane. And so, again, still not knowing my limits, I'm sitting behind her on the plane, and I tap her on the shoulder, and she turns around. I said, hi, you're Gloria Steinem. And she said, yeah. I said, you don't remember me, but you almost grew in my life. She said, what? I said, years ago, you visited King and Spalding, and we had a great meeting, and then you went on some, Meet the Press, and threw me under the bus. You said that we asked for a meeting to air our grievances. That wasn't true. And I said, why did you do that? She thought about it, and she said, it's all for the cause. So
That's memorable.
that's memorable.
And you are now working King and Spalding, and I interrupted you because you had seen the bright lights of New York.
Yes.
And As a consequence of that, what did you do?
I just went to New York. Decided I was gonna live in New York and sort of get the last remnants of Chattanooga out of me. And, so I go to New York and I'm looking at these firms. I can't tell the difference. They all seem the same to me. And so I took a job, I got a bunch of offers because, why not? Had good credentials with King and Spalding, so I got a job with a good big firm, did that for a few months, then realized maybe I'd made the wrong choice. And I think it's probably because I was used to King and Spalding, which is sort of a tight knit, whatever. So I was sort of offended that none of the Wilkie Farr partners were inviting me out to dinner, because that's New York. I didn't realize it was the difference between, they were going home to Connecticut.
Yeah.
So
Island.
right. So I changed firms. So I went to a firm that I thought was going to be more like what I was used to. It was a Philadelphia firm in New York. It was Morgan Lewis. So I did that for a while, but not happy. So I'd go
Was
out.
it the same thing that you had mentioned before? The Atlanta firm was camaraderie and people that you
Yeah.
knew and socializing, and yet now you're in New York and
Just not that much of that. And so I was just not very happy. And I'd go to the beach on weekends. I'd go to East Hampton with these other friends of mine. And I remember this one woman would be complaining about how much work she had to do and just needed people. And I was complaining about I hate my work, and all of a sudden something clicked with her. So she went to her people, and next thing I knew, I moved to White and Case, which was great. So loved White and Case. It's a wonderful firm. And I was there for quite a few years. And then my group picks up and moves to Skadden. But I had already moved. I didn't want to move. I was happy where I was. And so I said, no, I wasn't going to go. I wasn't going to go. So I stayed, but my group had gone. And then a year later, I ran into the head of the group from SCAD. I ran into him on 3rd Avenue. And he said, Barbara, what are you doing? So I said, okay. So I picked up and I moved to Skadden, where I was also very happy.
and a lot of what you were doing at White and Case, I think you said doing deals, working with banks. Is that about the time you met your husband?
Yes.
Okay, so were you at White and Case when you got married?
Mm-hmm.
And then you moved
Right.
over to Skadden Arps.
Right.
And what was the nature of the work that you were doing there?
Still representing banks and deals.
And did you find that you had shifted from being the briefcase carrier to?
Oh, yeah. Then I was doing my own deals by that point.
And I think you said that that there was a Hutton Williams in Richmond, Virginia. He was a very old lawyer.
Right. That was at Hutton and Williams. This is actually back when I was at King and Spalding.
Okay.
So I was doing deals. I was carrying the briefcase, and we go into this is back in the beginning, and I remember going to the office, and the Hutton Williams lawyer, who actually later became a very good friend of mine. But I go in, and he was wearing a tie that said "male chauvinist pig." And so again, not knowing my place, I said, "Oh, that's an interesting tie, Harry. Do you also have one that says racist that you wear when you're dealing with a black lawyer?" So we became sort of friendly after that. And I remember he was representing, I always called him Harry the Hat, because he was representing like 3 parties in the deal. We were representing the investment bank, but he'd be representing the authority and the bank and whatever. And he said, "Now I'm wearing the hat representing the authority, whatever." So Harry the Hat. And then I remember we went to lunch, and Harry the Hat took us to lunch, and we go into the Richmond Club. Maybe it was the Commonwealth Club. I don't remember the club, but we go in, and we started walking up the stairs of the club. He says, "Oh, you can't go in this door." So yeah, takes me out. I had to go into the kitchen because women weren't allowed to go into the front door. That was
That was true in Nashville too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Okay, so now you're working over at Skadden Arps, and at what point did you become involved in the American Bar Association?
Back in the day when I was at King and Spalding.
Because that's an important part of
That's
everything you're doing.
right. there was, that was back in the day when people, when partners were, when you're carrying the briefcase, it wasn't just to carry the briefcase, it's you, part of the job of being a partner was bringing the associates along and teaching them things. So one day I'm sitting in my office and this fella partner, a couple doors down, Kirk McCoy comes in and says, Barbara, you're going to Chicago for American Bar Association meeting. I said, I'm doing what? He said, yeah, that's what we do here. So he sort of takes me by the ear and takes me and says, you're going to the young lawyers section of the American Bar Association. So in 1976, 77, I don't remember when it was a long time ago. I go to my first Bar Association meeting because Kirk McCoy, who was a former president of the junior bar, chair of the junior bar, which is called back then, said that's what you need to do. That's how you make contacts. That's what you do. And so I went to the young lawyer section meeting and then never missed a meeting since.
And this fellow, Kirk
Kirk
McAlpin,
McCoy,
he brought you in,
yes.
and what happened? You said you haven't missed a meeting, but there's also some chemistry about participating in an organization and positions that sometimes are more advantageous than just going as a member of the ABA and attending a meeting.
Well,
So
you
what
find your niche, and it was easy and still easy when you go as a young lawyer to join the young lawyers section, which is now the young, it started as the junior bar, then became the young lawyers section, then became the young lawyers division. And it's an easy place to find your niche and to feel comfortable. Now, the first time you go, I always tell people, you don't feel comfortable, it's terrifying. And then you go back the next time, and all of a sudden there are people you know, and it's much less terrifying. And
you build your network.
you build your network, and I'm still incredibly friendly with, I talked about the Mean Girls. There's another group. This group is Old Friends, Best Friends, and they're people that I met through the Young Lawyers Division. Two of them are former presidents of the ABA. One was chair of the Commission on Women. One just got a Margaret Brent, but we started as young lawyers, not knowing anybody, and we still get together because we're lifelong friends, old friends, best friends.
So how did you find your network at the ABA, and what position or sections did you find most beneficial to you?
Well, the young lawyers, I tell everybody to get involved in young lawyers because that just
As a stepping
as a stepping stone, but also that's where you make these lifelong friends. There are substantive sections that can absolutely advance your career. You make contacts that are invaluable and friends that are invaluable in your area of practice. And so I was chair of the young lawyers, but also at the same time was getting involved in the business law section. And have worked in the business law section for many years. I worked my way up and became chair of the business law section. And still am an officer of the business law section.
And did that put you somewhat into the administrative side, or
But as I went along, I was doing a lot of both. The governance of the ABA is done through the House of Delegates. And so there are different representative capacities in the House of Delegates. And so I've sort of touched all those bases. I was a representative from the young lawyers. I served 2 terms on the Board of Governors of the ABA, so sat on the House of Delegates at that. I currently sit on the House of Delegates as a delegate from the business law section. And so got involved in the governance part that way.
and you undertook several meaningful positions, I guess, or advocacy
Right.
within the ABA.
Right. One of the great things about being part of the ABA is it keeps you broad. You know, the longer you practice law, and especially now, the narrower you get. I can remember years ago, I was sitting in the House of Delegates. I was still in New York from the New York. I was representing New York County lawyers in the House of Delegates, and I would sit next to the senior partner at Skadden named Kim DeYalkin. And we'd sit there, and the debate would be going on, and he'd say, "Oh, I hate this," and I go, "I love this. I love this," because you were dealing with issues that were beyond your immediate practice, but it's why you went to law school in the first place. The rule of law, they're just important legal issues, and it kept you broad. And being in the House of Delegates, you became an advocate. Even though it's big, people rely on you to advocate. And I remember one of my first issues that I had to carry in the House of Delegates. I got pretty active in the House of Delegates. Politically,
How big is the House?
it's like 250.
Okay. From all over the United States.
From all over the United States. They actually maybe 500. It's big. It's big because you have representation from state and local bars. You have representation from sections and ABA entities. You have representation from affiliated organizations. So it's big, and it's a mix. And so I have been asked to advocate on a issue with respect to Russian lawyers and an agreement that the American Bar Association wanted to enter into with Russian Lawyers Association. Well, there was a group that didn't want to do it and whatever, so I was asked to advocate on behalf of the board or whatever in favor of this. So I thought, okay, I can do that. So I prepared my remarks. I get up there and find out that my adversary on the floor was Alan Dershowitz. And I think the technical, I won't get bleeped out, was, oh shit. I'm a corporate securities lawyer at this time, and I'm supposed to be advocating against Alan Dershowitz. So it was a little frightening.
He was then younger.
He was then younger, as was I. But we get up and he advocates, and I get up and I counter his argument. And I just torched his ass. It was great. It was great. And I realized I can do this. I can do this. And it was really and he was mad. He was mad that this girl, this security got the best. He was so mad. I remember he was so mad. It was so fulfilling. But then I realized I can do this. I can do this.
Well, having taken that position about the Russian lawyers, what was memorable about some of the ethical concerns that were raised while you were in the business sections, the bond sections? Because banks were at that time wanting to get bond work.
Right. Well, that reminds me of a story that there was something known in the industry as pay to play. And with pay to play, it was understood that investment banks, in order to get business, had to make political contributions to get business in the municipal area.
Right.
And one of the great deals I worked on was I was called by this consortium of New York banks they wanted to stop it. They hated it. So they got together and asked me to draft an agreement among the banks that they would not do it. No more pay to play. Well, it was great. So drafted this, we worked it out, we hammered it out, and it was all under the eye of the chair of the SEC, a guy named Arthur Levitt. And so we got it done, and we were flown to Washington on the Bear Stearns plane with all the CEOs and the general counsels, and me, nobody. This is senior associate, I guess, at the point at Skadden. And we flew to the SEC to sign the agreement. All the press was there. It was a big day. I had come from Chattanooga and I was doing this, and this was huge. I was so happy. So we go in, and the press is outside, and they want to know who's signing and all this stuff. We're ushered inside. You had to sign in. And we go in and there's a big signing ceremony, Arthur Levitt saying, you all have done this great thing. So anyway, it was great. We fly back on the Bear Stearns plane and I'm thinking it doesn't get any better than this. And next day I wake up and there's the front page of the Wall Street Journal. You know, there's this pay to play thing and the banks have agreed to do it. But here's who has signed this agreement not to make any political contributions. And it goes through Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Bear Stearns and Skadden Arps. I went, dang, Skadden Arps, you know, we didn't sign it. Well, some intrepid reporter had taken the sign-in sheet and taken a picture of the sign-in sheet and figured that's who has agreed to do this. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble now. So, you know, everybody thinks I've signed this thing that whatever. So I think, and I remember the managing partner of the firm wasn't in town, so I had to go. And I went to Joe Flom, Skadden Arps, Marr and Flom, the Joe Flom of Skadden Arps. Named partner to tell him, whoops. So I go into his office, knock on the door. You know, you may not remember me. I'm Barbara Mayden. I'm nobody. But you may know in the Wall Street Journal, it says today that Skadden Arps has signed this agreement never to make a political contribution again. Here's how I think it happened, whatever. You know, and he sits there and I realize this is what makes him Joe Flom, and this is what makes me nobody. He sits there a minute and says, that's great. I said, that's great. Want to explain that to me? Why is that great? He said, we don't have to make any political contribution anymore. We didn't have to sign it, but nobody's going to expect us to sign it, and we don't have to do it. That's great. So I realized, you know, I still had a lot to learn. But subsequently, Arthur Levitt came to the floor of the House of Delegates of the ABA to thank, you know, basically I got thanked on the floor of the House of Delegates, which nobody will remember but me.
But it was a big achievement.
It was big.
And it was important.
It was big.
And I think you said that there were other committees that you chaired. For instance, with regards to advocacy on behalf of people that were being discriminated against, and whether it was anti-Semitism or advocating for women. And you had quite a record there.
I was in the right place, again, not knowing when to stop. There was a guy, I was appointed to the first Commission on Minorities in the profession, which was great and very interesting. And then a guy named Bob McCrate was president of the ABA from New York, and I would go to Bob McCrate and say, you know what, women, we need to do something for women. Because he says, well, we'll make it the Commission on Minorities and Women. I said, the issues are very different, needs to be separate. So he said, okay. And he created a separate Commission on Women that he appointed me to. And then he said, so I was on the very first Commission on Women in the profession, which was great. And then, but I remember he called me and said, oh, so I got this great chair of your commission. And I said, great. He said, you're going to love her. And I said, oh, that's great. Who is she? She said, well, she's the wife of the governor of Arkansas, but she's a lawyer in the Rose Law Firm in Arkansas. I said, never heard of her. Her name is Hillary Clinton. I said, great. Who knew? Who knew from Hillary Clinton? So Hillary became the first chair of this small commission. It was great. So that first Commission on Women was life-changing. It was, we did wonderful things, wrote wonderful things, and just did a lot of research and made a lot of issues public that theretofore had not been public.
I think that part of what you were telling me with regards to your experience with this American Bar Association is exactly that, these opportunities that
Yes.
you came into. You were working at King and Spalding when Carter was elected, and you had a front seat
Yes.
about, and I assume that you were still politically active then.
Yes.
So when you are on the same committee with Hillary Clinton, did that afford you another political opportunity later on when he decided to run for president?
Well, it was just a great front row seat. It was a great front row seat. It was a very tight knit, it was a great group.
In talking about the law firms that you were with, you've talked about how you developed the practice areas that you were in. Did you have any counseling strategies or business practices that you felt were developed as you went through the various law firms? Did it change? Did it just improve?
Well, the business strategy was getting out there and making yourself known. As it was, things were gradually changing in terms of the expectation. If you started and somebody would train you, and then 6 years later you become a partner, I mean, things were changing. And so the onus has become much more on you to develop the skills and the connections that are valued by a firm. And
no one's teaching us to.
and nobody's teaching them to you, with exceptions, but basically that's true. And so getting out there and joining a bar association, whether it be the American Bar Association, the Tennessee Bar, the Nashville Bar, making friends, getting to know people, and establishing yourself as an expert is key. I've got involved in the business law section. You go to these meetings and you just way over your head and whatever, but the more you did it, the more you got, and then you start raising your hand. Well, somebody, we need somebody to draft this article. You raise your hand. You may not know much about it then, but you sure will after you do the article. And whose name is on the article? It's your name. They want to do a CLE, who knows this stuff? Well, Barbara wrote the article, so maybe she knows it. So that's how you get yourself out there. And you're also making connections where people know your name and they're going to refer business to you, no matter what the association.
As you're talking about this, I know that you mentioned observing how things have changed. And one of those is how the corporate culture is changing and what is being passed down. And how did you see the corporate culture changing? You already mentioned the difference between Atlanta and New York as far as the camaraderie, I'll call it. What did you observe over the last 20, 25 years of how it's changed for the practice of law and that corporate culture, and what is being passed down?
Well, there is an incentive in law firms. And of course, this is generally speaking, you always have exceptions, but the incentive in law firms, you always hear about the huge salaries which are crazy. Remember about $17,000 a year?
So rich.
Right. The exponential pay explosion and whatever, and not only at the associate level and the partner level, the incentives are different. When you pay an associate the gazillion dollars a year to start, your best interest is not having that associate carry a briefcase and learn at the heels of someone, but get that person in, working as quickly as possible and doing something that they can do over and over and over again efficiently as soon as possible. In order to, so it's really up to you as the lawyer to make sure you're getting the experience that's gonna, it's gonna serve you better in the years to come. Yeah, you're making a lot of money, but there's no partnership at the end of that tunnel unless you're one of the lucky few. So you need to stay broad. You need to know things. You do that by asking for the work you want, and by getting out and making the connections that are going to get that work that you need to make yourself a better lawyer by getting that.
One of the areas that you mentioned about changes had to do with administration when you were representing Morgan Stanley, one transaction, and they began to hand out the checks.
That was very interesting. You know, working for investment bankers and whatever, and you go to these closings and they would hand out checks at the closing. And they were
The men with the
big-
various hats.
Oh, yes, oh, yes. And they get their checks and you get your check and it was paltry compared to what the bankers were getting. And what, you know, the companies were getting, anything with the law firms, you know, billing by the hour, you know, it was a fraction. And a lot of smart partners law firm started saying, well, you know what? That's, you know, we're making these deals go. And why are we getting the chump change? And that's when billing, the billing norms change. Only the chumps were billing by the hour. And you would do what was called premium billing. And I was sort of there for the change of that. You billed what the deal would get you. And
so in a sense, there was a change in the corporate culture too, because the senior partners no longer wanted to just be upper middle class.
oh, no, they want, you know,
They wanted
they,
to be in the upper
yeah.
echelon.
yes,
And that's true today, is it not?
absolutely. You know, back in the day, upper middle class, like, you know, here we are, we've made it. That's not the goal. And partners are making millions. That can.
You were talking about being associated with powerful people, and
Mhm.
you had a number of them in your experience who lifted you up.
Yes.
And how important is that to someone coming along as you develop your network? These people that you meet either through the ABA, you mentioned about women becoming more visible.
Mhm.
And there was, I think, a woman named Brooksy
Brooksy Bourne.
Barnes, who was a good friend of yours.
Oh, well, Brooks, when I was coming up, I don't think it's an exaggeration. There were a couple women in Washington that everybody knew. They were the standard, and that was her name was Brooksy Landau. Then she became Brooksy Bourne. They divorced. She got but Brooksy Bourne and Marna Tucker. You didn't get any bigger than Brooksy and Marna. Everybody had heard of Brooksy and Marna, and they are still. They're not practicing, but they're just still giants. And they made it a practice to bring women along. I remember I was on the board of governors of the ABA, and I was young, but I was on the board of governors. There I was, representing the state of New York, and there were on the board. It was me, and it was Brooksy Bourne, and a woman named Elaine Jones. And Elaine Jones was head of the Inc. Fund at the time, NAACP Inc. Fund, and we'd be in the room, and somebody would say something especially awful, and we would catch one another's eye, and it was like, and we had the secret language. All right, whose turn is it? You can't say that. But just you know, when there were few, you just develop these great networks, and people brought other people along, and it was very gratifying.
I I asked you about Bob Steed
Yeah.
at King and Spalding
Mhm.
as a mentor.
Yes.
And then you have someone like Brooksy
Brooksy
Bourne,
Bourne. Mhm.
who is a mentor in a different way,
Yes.
you know,
Mhm.
more of a co-support rather
Right.
than a mentor-mentee
Oh, no, but she was way
way.
past my pay grade. Right.
So these are people that have played a part in your career development. How do you see you playing that role for people behind you?
Well, that ship may have passed, but still, to the extent that I can, and always have,
I think that's what I want you to talk about, is
Right.
what you have done.
right, try to
Open doors.
open doors. One thing, when I was chair of the business law section, started something called the Fellows of the Business Law section. But you go find young lawyers and who have showed leadership skills and bring them into the business law section to and give them an opportunity to showcase their skills. But just try to do that along the way.
And what are some of the business strategies that you've found helpful? I think you said you were at Skadden Arps up until about 1995,
Right.
thereabouts, and
Yeah.
then you made a change.
Yes.
And what did you do?
Picked up and moved to Nashville, Tennessee.
And why did you do
Well,
that?
that's a very good question. When I married my husband and we, he said, well, I never want to raise kids in the city. And I thought, yeah, like he was gonna remember that. And then boom, 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 we had the 3 kids and he remembered, much to my horror. And so we were looking for where to go. And so I thought, well, I guess I'll go back to Atlanta. But in the meantime, Atlanta had turned into LA. I thought, well, I don't want to do that. So we basically threw a dart at a map and found Nashville. Now, I grew up in Chattanooga, but they call it the 3 states of Tennessee for good reason. They're 3 very, very distinct regions. I think I went to Nashville for my 9th grade class trip to go to the Capitol, but it's the only time I'd ever been to Nashville. I knew nothing about Nashville. I knew East Tennessee, but somehow the start on a map ended in Nashville. We knew nothing. I decided to take a year off, which I did. I taught part-time at the law school and tried to figure out the dynamics of Nashville and get my kids in school and whatever.
How old were they when you moved here?
They were 3, 2, and 1.
Wow.
Yeah.
They were little.
They were little. They were little. So got that taken care of. And then, got a job at a good law firm. That would be Basbury and Sims. And
Doing bond work,
no, by this time I'm doing more just
transactions,
right?
mergers,
Mergers,
like that.
Yeah, just general corporate counseling.
and
But,
as
it's all mentors, whatever. I knew Jim Cheek through the business law section, the ABA. I knew Lee Walton through the ABA. And you make these contacts
and that helps you. when
that
you're making-
helps, yeah.
When you were talking about moving here, how did your husband decide to make a job change?
Well, that was back in the day when everybody was getting packaged out of their jobs in finance. They would get laid off, but they would get a package, so he knew he wanted to move, so he was trying desperately to get a package. So he was trying his best to get himself fired. And he just couldn't do it. So finally he goes to, the guy out in Florida, listen, I want to go to Nashville. Just get rid of me, please. No, it's first thing the guy said, well, go to Chicago. You can go, I'm gonna go to Chicago. Okay. And then finally the guy says, go to Nashville. I says, Nashville? There's no Bankers Trust in Nashville. Well, it turns out that there was a back office of Bankers Trust in Nashville. This is before remote work and all this stuff. There was actually a Bankers Trust office out at I don't remember, just way out, just nowhere. And they said, just work out of there. Dang. So that's what he said, fine. So we ended up going to Nashville. I always laughed that they were like heel marks all the way down the East Coast for me, because I was drugged down to Nashville. But because I had a great life there, I had my friends and whatever, everything was set.
And it was easy for you with regards to your children and schooling and everything.
So easy.
Because you don't drive anywhere. You
don't drive. I would get my kids in the double stroller and I would go across the park and I would drop them at the preschool and I would go to it was so easy. Strapping them into car seats? I don't think so. But you know what? After about a year, you couldn't have drug me back.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Did you know anybody? Did he know anybody?
I knew a couple of people I had done some deals with. I knew nobody, basically.
Did he know anybody?
No.
And how did you meet?
But we met people. People introduced us. We just it's funny because I was a little crazy, and I would people would give me names, And I was so organized and so, I said, I need to know everything. So I would get names, and Diane Coon still remembers that somebody asked where the best place to buy exit, and she said, I don't know, call Barbara Mayden, she'll know. That's right after I moved, because I'd called everybody and said, where do I go to the grocery store? Where's the post office? Where's the this? What are the schools? So anybody who knew anybody.
And did you mention Barb, just Diane Coon?
Right.
How did you meet Annette Eskin?
So this guy I mentioned before, Ken Bialkin. So, okay, so I'm in my office and Ted kept saying Nashville, Nashville, Nashville. And so I did a little bit of research, but back then you always shared a printer, but people don't have their own printer. And so I shared a printer with this guy in the office next to me named Ken Bialkin. When I say next to me, he had the great big corner office. He was the guy at Skadden. That's a whole long story, which I won't go into, but I had become friendly with Ken Bialkin, which was hilarious because nobody was friendly with Ken Bialkin. He was so scary.
Except for you.
Well, I made it my job.
And you went in and you said to him, what's up?
Well, what happened was that there were just a few women at Skadden, and we would have lunch together in the Skadden cafeteria. And we were terrifying to people because I remember one time this senior partner coming to the cafeteria, putting his tray down, looking around and seeing these, oops, and he put and goes. So we were sort of scary. But one day we were talking about Ken Bialkin, and they were saying like nobody, he has no friends. And from people scared, I said, I can be friends with Ken Bialkin. They said, nobody's friends. I said, just watch. So one day he had this phalanx of secretaries around his office, like his guards. And one day I went and I sort of muscled my way through, and I went and leaned against the door and said, so Ken, what's up? And you're like, what? Nobody ever done that. So anyway, and I would, nothing much. It was very nice and pleasant, and I left. And then a week later, I would sort of sidle into his office and say, so Ken, what's new? How's family? Well, sort of friendly. And then one day I'm sitting in my office.
Not the New York way, is it?
No. So I'm sitting in my office and I see a sort of a shadow at the door, and I look up and there's Ken Bialkin. Said, what's up? Nothing much. Come sit down. Let's chat. So we actually became friends. And as I said, we shared a printer, and I would go to the printer and I would pick up my merger agreement, and I would pick up his Dear Yitzhak letter, Yitzhak Rabin. He was all head of international Jewish groups. So one day when we started talking about, I would also call it Mr. Jew because he knew every Jew in the country. So I went into Ken, because one thing I didn't know, even though I grew up in Chattanooga, there are any Jews in Nashville. I'm Jewish. I'm in a Jewish community, but I just sort of didn't know. So I go in and I said, well, this is a weird question, Ken. Are there any Jews in Nashville? Is it Nashville, Tennessee? I said, yeah. He said, sit down. So I sat down. He takes out a legal pad and he draws 3 circles. He said, these are the Eskins. These are the Mays. These are the Worthens. These are the families you need to know. And then he starts riffing on Nashville. This is so great. But it turns out, unbeknownst to me, not that he wouldn't have known anyway, he was married to an Eskin.
Oh.
He was married to an Eskin. And so I come into Nashville, and he had laid the carpet out for me. Annette Eskin,
She's wonderful.
is wonderful. Annette Eskin, Marlene Moses, all the Eskins, they were there to welcome me, and I got embraced. And you know what? That was a great way to be welcomed into Nashville.
Kind of Southern.
It's kind of Southern. And then he said, then what you do, the first thing you do is you join all the synagogues. I said, what? He said, it's just the way you do it in Nashville. Everybody's supportive of one another. So I don't know about joining all the synagogues. You join all the synagogues. And back then they were 3. So I got here, of course, we joined all the synagogues.
And you got to meet people.
And you got to meet
another
people.
network.
Another network. And I remember I did a fundraising once. I was chair of a fundraising at West End Synagogue. And I never forgot that. I remember telling Ken, 2 of my biggest donors were Temple people, because they thought it was important to have a strong conservative place. It was just that kind of city.
And it still is.
And it still is.
So when you're doing this and you're getting introduced to the Nashville community in the Jewish
Right.
community too. Did you immediately go right back to work? You said you were
I waited a
teaching
year.
Okay. because your
sort of-
children are small
My children were tiny. I had to get them in school, and
and you taught at Vanderbilt
I
right
was teaching
away?
part-time. I was teaching adjunct at Vanderbilt. When I was on the Commission on Women, that first commission, I was traveling around the country giving speeches.
Lots of talks.
And I gave one of the talks at Vanderbilt. And then they took my speech and they made it into a Vanderbilt magazine thing. And so the dean at the time heard I was coming to Nashville, and so asked me to teach adjunct, which I did. And I continued to do that after I went to work.
And then you said you knew Jim Cheek through the ABA, and you did start at Bass.
Right.
Still doing all of these mergers, acquisitions, and transactions. And you mentioned Lee Walton.
Mhm.
Did you interact with her while you were at
Oh,
Bass?
absolutely. She was my bud. She's still my bud.
So you expanded your network, some through your relationships with the ABA individuals, and some through personal connections that you had made in New York
Yeah.
that helped.
And
you
of course, I joined the Tennessee Bar.
Right.
And active in the Tennessee Bar Association, because I have learned along the years that it's a great way to connect with other lawyers and other smart people.
So you'd been with Bass for a while, and then you decided maybe to become
Something.
not in a firm.
Okay, so it's funny, I always say it for a little while. Lee reminds me I was there 10 years, but so maybe more than just a little while, but I was a partner at Bass and everything was fine. I had my kids late, so my kids were little. And
If you were there 10 years, then they are now 13, 12, and 11. They're still.
Right. Yeah. And I decided, you know what? Done that. I'm tired. I've worked ever since I was in high school, and I thought I'm gonna take some time and I'm not work for a while. I remember, I don't know if I told you the story, but I decided I was gonna do that, and I went home and I picked up one of my daughters at school that day, and she was in the back seat, and I said, yeah, do you like it when mommy picks you up? She said, yeah, it was great. And I said, well, mommy's gonna be doing it a lot more. She said, why? I said, I think I'm gonna, retire. And she started to cry. I said, Jenny, why are you crying? She said, I don't want you to be like all the other mommies. She liked having a mommy who was a lawyer. But it was my youngest daughter's bat mitzvah. And this guy comes to town who I knew through the ABA, one of my friends from young lawyer days. And he was a partner at a law firm at Nelson Mullins. And he was in Charlotte at the time, or maybe, but he said he had a great idea. He said, we need, he said, Barbara, you know half the world, the business law and whatever, and I know half the world. He's active in labor employment law and whatever. He said, we need to start a recruiting firm. That, a lot of people know lawyers across the street and they can move lawyers across the street, but we know lawyers from Phoenix to Boston to whatever. So that crazy idea, we did it. So we started a recruiting firm and have done that for the last, I say 10 years, maybe more, but that's.
And it is part of the changing world.
Yeah.
For lawyers and law firms.
Much more mobile. Yeah.
Part of the questionnaire that they have for this is to ask you about the impact of your career on your family life and your social activities, and what impact did it have for you?
Well, I don't know the impact of my family life. I think we have a perfectly wonderful family,
And your children are now 30, 32, and 34?
Yes.
Okay.
And we have a very close family, none of my girls chose law, but they're wonderful. My husband's wonderful and supportive. So how did that affect my family life? I don't know.
Is he still working?
No, he's retired. So we
And
just try to avoid each other, not getting each other's way.
so what did you find to be the rewards and advantages of a legal career?
Just the people you met, making you think hard, making you think hard, making you think hard out of the box. What's the issue? How can you help fix it? You look at a problem, how can I help solve it? Your legal training is about solving problems, and that you learn you're a problem solver. And so whatever the context, whether it's a legal issue, whether it's, an issue at your synagogue, whether it is family issue, how can I think through this and help make it better?
I know that one thing you told me early on is the reward was you got to eat steak more often than you.
And I can eat steak any damn time I want.
And although it's probably not true when you ended your career, you were really, really earning a big salary when you started. So you were able to,
$17,000, right?
you could support yourself.
I could eat steak every night if I wanted.
And another observation that I recall you making is about the flexibility that it gave you.
Yes.
As far as an advantage of having a legal career, because you actually made transitions. You went from doing bond work and briefcase carrying to doing mergers and acquisitions to using a lot of those skills in your participation with the American Bar Association that, as you just pointed out, made a wide network for you, not just in where you were practicing law, but
Yes.
nationwide.
Yes.
So you did have an opportunity or a platform. You had a big floor as opposed to a little floor
Yes.
through this
Yes.
practice of law.
Yes.
And I think you said, it does teach you to be an advocate.
Yes.
Um,
And again, when I say advocate, yes, it's the little things and the big things, being an advocate in the room or whatever, but also taught me that even though I was a securities lawyer, I could debate Alan Dershowitz, and win. That the skills are transferable.
What were some of the hardships or the pitfalls of having a legal career?
It's hard. It's hard. You can never leave it behind. It's not like, I shouldn't say this, but there was a resolution in front of the House of Delegates recently when the young lawyers wanted to, like, some leave policies or advocating leave policies where you really are leaving things behind. Well, you can't leave things behind.
No.
You have clients. The whole nature of the practice of law is that you have clients and their problems aren't 9 to 5. And so you have to learn to adapt to that. And you do, but you learn to adapt by learning to make the time when you can for not doing it. You just learn to adapt, but it's hard and it can be all enveloping.
And how would you describe the major contributions, either to society, the practice of law, or legal history that you feel you participated in or made these contributions?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I hope.
Now, this is not a time for humble.
No, I can't leave her side humble, but
Well, you were the chair of the ABA task force.
I am the chair of the ABA task force to combat anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism has been going on for thousands of years. I don't think that this 1-year task force that I'm going to be able to say
Change
that I combated anti-Semitism, but by making people aware that it's there, making people aware of the history and the what's going on around the world. Hopefully we can make some steps in the right direction. So through that or through other initiatives, you hope that you've made a little bit of a difference.
How, I think that is important, and I think in today's current state of affairs, it's probably more important than it's ever been.
Certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot happening in our lifetime, particularly with regards to the rule of law, and that's something that you've mentioned before. How do you see the rule of law with regards to law firms in the future?
Well, that's a whole nother hour, but the rule of law is the bottom line. It is the concrete that holds our society together. And once there start to be cracks in that concrete, we're in huge trouble. And we have become complacent. I've become complacent. It's, we've lived in sort of a golden age where we all knew there was a bottom line and there was a line that was not crossable. And that line appears now to be crossable to many. And we all
ignored.
Well, we all need to be aware that that there are those who don't respect these rules and be willing to stand up, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. I'm not talking politics. I'm talking basic human rights and basic just the basics. That there is a line that you don't go through. That's what makes us America. And we all need to be aware of it, no matter what your politics are, and stand up for it.
What advice would you give to a young lawyer about not only the rule of law, but what they can do in the changing world of the legal environment? How do
It's up to them. I told you about whirlwind tour of New York law firms. Two of my law firms are law firms that capitulated, I believe, recently. And it's horrifying. And the young associates in those law firms, two of mine, Wilkie Farr and Skadden Arps, both have, as far as I'm concerned, capitulated. But young lawyers have looked hard and said, I can't be a part of this, and have spoken out. And I admire their bravery and left. Right. And I admire their bravery, and they'll be fine. And I just am so proud to watch that.
It's a hard decision.
It's a hard decision. Of course, it's a hard decision.
Part of what young lawyers, I think, and even lawyers in mid-career are facing is a little bit of what you said about the changing legal environment.
Yes.
That you can't just go in and do the same thing over and over again. How do you recommend that they advance themselves?
They have to understand that nobody's going to do it for them. And that if they want to be broader and stay broad, they have to figure out a way to do that. They go and ask for the right work. They, if you find yourself in, getting narrower and narrower and not getting a chance to do something related or whatever, you go and ask for that work. And you go and you say, Lee Walton is his big corporate partner at Bass. You go to Lee and say, I've watched you do these mergers and whatever, and I would just love to, you feed that ego, and the next deal that comes up.
Or you stop and say, what's up?
Or you stop and say, what's up? Exactly. But you ask for the work. And when some deal comes up, who's Lee going to think about to go and tap on the shoulder? It's that person that actually asked for it.
Right.
So don't just sit there like the receiving end of a funnel and just take what's dropped down to you. Go ask for what you want and what's going to broaden your career.
Well, I think you mentioned that there's no real interest in these law firms to give you broad experience. So you wrote and you spoke and you promoted yourself
Mhm.
by volunteering and raising your
Yes.
hand. And I think a lot of young lawyers don't see the benefit
Yeah,
of
well,
bar associations.
they need to. I'll go preach that gospel anytime, because, that's how you get your name out there. Who's the expert on X? The expert on X is the person that's written about it, the person that, that's on the CLE panels. How do you get to do that? You go to the business all section meeting, you go to the Nashville bar, section meeting, whatever, you raise your hand, you write the article, all of a sudden you wrote the article. You know that stuff. Somebody wondering about, if people call me the other day, I need a corporate lawyer in Nashville that does X, I figure out, well, who would that be? Then I look and who's written about that or whatever. So you send it to.
And that's part of self-promoting.
That's
But
self-promoting,
still,
right?
it's also learning
Yes, yes,
and networking.
yes.
How do you see the role of today's lawyer and the law firms in the future?
Well, I hope there's a pause in the corporatization and that,
How do you see that happening?
I don't know.
Because
I don't know.
I think that is an observation that a lawyer in a relatively important law firm here told me about law firms in Nashville that have historically been associated with Nashville are being taken over
Yes.
by.
We were the last. It's funny that it was late to come to Nashville, but here it is. It's here.
And
It's
they
here.
are acquiring them
Yes.
and they are becoming not so much law firms, but corporate
Yeah,
entities.
yeah.
And so how do you see that impacting the practice of law?
Well, just as what you're saying. It's bottom line oriented. I think it's gonna be up to the partners in these firms, in these Nashville offices of these firms, to have a commitment to a culture that makes you want to go to work every day.
And it is, I think, not only the law firms that are changing, but technology is changing the world we live in.
Absolutely.
So that this idea of young people going to practice law
Mhm.
it's really changing quite a bit.
I would go and do, you do a first draft of a merger agreement. And you go and you get the form and you mark up the form, and it's sort of almost mindless, but that's how you learn what's in the form.
That's right.
That's whatever.
You go through everything.
You go through everything, and then you have to translate what's in that form to the specifics of your deals, whatever. And that's what your first year lawyer's doing in the transaction area. Well, you know what? AI makes that sort of a redundancy. I mean, why do you need a first year lawyer to do that when you can whisper into AI, here's my deal, give me a first draft? What's going to happen with the training of
That's
young
right.
lawyers? And I'm not smart enough to have the answer to that, but it's
there.
It's there.
Well, let's go to the present now. You mentioned that you've been in the recruitment
Yes.
on a national level for lawyers to go to different law
right.
firms. What other current activities are you involved in?
Well, I'm retired from that. I'm no longer doing that. I've retired, and so mostly what I'm doing now is crossword puzzles and Wordle and the like.
All right. And what projects have you yet to accomplish? What are some of the projects that you have on your?
Well, there is the
to do
project
that?
of combating anti-Semitism. That's
That's a
keeping
big
up the streak,
project.
right? I'm also still active in the American Bar. I'm still, believe it or not, an officer of the business law section. I'm a delegate to the House of Delegates still. I mean, assuming it's gotta be enough already. I've done this for well over 30 years.
Are you training people to take your place?
I'm trying to, I am trying to, but I just keep getting pulled back in, but that will come.
Tell me about the parameters for your type of retirement. What is it that you see besides Wordle and
Well, I've got to figure out what that is. I am working on, working with the American Cancer Society to drive cancer patients to, appointments. I'm starting to work on that. I'm just trying to see what works out. I'm lucky enough to now spend my summers in Maine. So I'm doing a lot of hiking and, which is nice. And I'm just trying to see what sounds like fun.
the final question is, what advice would you give to someone thinking of becoming a lawyer?
Do it for a well-reasoned reason, not because you're afraid that you can't order steak. There are easier ways to get steak. And go into it with an open mind. Don't let yourself get narrow. Just be open. And remember the rule of law, that's why you did it in the first place. I don't care what your specialty is. You can be a bond lawyer, you can be a, no matter what you decide, that's what you can do. I'm going to show you something. And I actually did not even plan to do that. I hope I have it with you. This is what, I might have done this to you before. You remember why you were to law school, no matter what you decide to do. And I carry this with me. It's the Constitution. No matter where you are, what you're doing, rule of law, this is why we're doing it. This is what makes us different. And this is what we're sworn to uphold. Carry it with you and let that be your guide. That doesn't mean that's not just for the civil rights attorneys or whatever. This is for, when we have things coming up for the business law section for the House of Delegates, and people say, well, what does that have to do with business law? Everything to do with business law. We're lawyers. We're lawyers.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.